Hello and welcome to another live stream from Just in Time Worlds. Today we are going to be talking about social hierarchies. And I'm quite looking forward to the stream because it is actually what I'm working on my world building book that will be out towards the end of this year. And if you want to see how I'm getting on with that, don't forget to check out the podcast, World Building Blueprints. Okay, so I'm going to start by moving to a scene and I'm going to talk about social hierarchies, what they are, and how you can use them in your world. So I wasn't 100% sure where to start this conversation because honestly, it could be started either from the family unit and discussing the family and then discussing social hierarchies, or you could start with social hierarchies and then how they influence the family unit. I decided to go with the social hierarchy first and then discuss the family unit. So we'll get to the family unit a little bit later in the stream. Okay, so let me talk about social hierarchies. What are social hierarchies? They are a means to rank society. It controls how resources are distributed, and it basically determines the pecking order of society, who has the most influence in a given society. And social hierarchy is prevalent everywhere. Where you have three humans gathered, there you have a social hierarchy. It is almost impossible to avoid. If you wanted to avoid having a social hierarchy in your world, you would probably have to fundamentally alter the nature of the creatures that rise to civilization level that you're telling the story about. Because it's not gonna be a simple thing to say, oh, no, these guys, they, you see, don't have a social hierarchy. It'll be a very complicated setup. If somebody on the chat just wants to confirm for me that they are good with all of the sound and all of the other elements, that would be great. In the meantime, we'll carry on with social hierarchies. Okay, so how do you determine social hierarchies? Are you kind of stuck with this from birth principle? Well, no. There are, in essence, two large categories of social hierarchy. And you can define them as either birth or ascribed. Okay, so, and what people mean when they say it's an ascribed social hierarchy, it means that this person is born into their social hierarchy. It is typically a caste type system or a system with very limited social mobility. And because of things that they are simply born with, or even the progress of time, sometimes you have cultures where the eldest are considered the most wise and the leaders, and therefore the eldest are your social hierarchy leaders, and that is also an ascribed property. The converse of this is if you have an achievement-based social hierarchy. So this is where you achieve something, and because of that, you get to a social hierarchy. Now, this isn't to say that one is great and better than the other or whatever. You can have badness in both of them. The achievement-based category could be based on the achievement of money that you inherit from your parents. So really, it's still an inherited property. The ascribed one could still require you to achieve something. You could have a place in potentia, which you then confirm with your ability to actually, with your actual abilities then. Okay, and hello to Dylan, who is one of the members of my channel. It is great to see you. Okay, so that is your ascribed versus your achievement. Now, examples of these kinds of social hierarchy. Now, I've got the patriarchy up here. Obviously, this is like the Roman or Greek society style of patriarchy, where you've got a very strict gender definition, right? And very strict gender roles. You can also, in a fantasy world, you can flip that around and have a matriarchy, or you can have multiple sexes and have a different kind of a sex associated with this patriarchy, matriarchy setup. You can also have a class system, which is more on your ascribed side. That is around your wealth, your profession, your culture, like the American Gilded Age or Victorian England. Now, as I say, obviously you have a lot of impact from your birth because you are born with certain, your parents are rich, or your parents are of a certain class, so you're of a certain class. But you would not necessarily achieve your parents' class without paying attention, without doing something. Okay, so I'm receiving a notification that there is trouble connecting. I am sorry, guys. I hope that everything is running smoothly. I hope that it's not too jerky. Okay. Times when it feels like live streaming is always such a risk. Okay, so continuing on in this discussion, we have our examples, and let's talk about exceptions. There are always going to be exceptions to these rules. There is always going to be exceptions to your very strict caste system, even your class system. And I want to point out here to an exception that is actually comes to us from Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is the concept of the Basha Posh. Now, this concept is when a girl is raised as a boy. Okay, so this is a very, very strange setup. The family has just girls, and in order to try and have a boy who can escort his sisters around, her sisters around, and who can ensure that and run errands and so on, and fulfill kind of a boy's role in the house, the parents will pick one of the daughters and they will raise this daughter as a Basha Posh, which is as a boy. And normally this person then, when they reach puberty, they're told to go back to being a girl, which can obviously create a lot of internal conflict in this person who's lived as a boy in a very gender stratified society. So that is a very interesting concept to play with in a gender-based society. Okay, so those are exceptions, and it is our social hierarchies. So why should you implement this in your world? Okay, so like I said, everything's got a hierarchy. It is going to be extremely hard to avoid a hierarchy. You could maybe do it, but you would end up with a situation where you are creating a society that is so weird, your readers would have a great deal of trouble recognizing it as a normal society, and they would have a great deal of difficulty connecting to characters from the society. So while you could do it, I would generally recommend that you definitely should have a social hierarchy. It can also be an enormous source of conflict and plot points. And naturally, it informs your characters' backgrounds, their fears, their aspirations, their challenges, and their perspective. It allows you to play with themes like, can people be born better? Or should we all be born equal and work our own way up? Is there such a thing as being born equal? These are all interesting human thematic elements that you can play with. And as such, they are extremely interesting. So you definitely want to implement your social hierarchy. And I'm quickly going to check the chat to see if anybody is in a conversational mood. Okay. Allura S says, I'm okay. That's good. Alrighty. Doesn't look like anybody is chatting extensively. All right. So let's take a look at some examples and how you actually do this. So starting with the actual world building elements that go into this, you have to decide whether you're going to go with an ascribed based situation. So are people born into their role, or whether it's an achievement based hierarchy? Do people achieve a certain class structure? And these two things give you two different plot points to play with. In the ascribed side, you can either do a storyline of somebody being resentful of being born into their role, and they want to try and be better, or you can go the other way around and have somebody born to a very high role that they don't feel comfortable in, that they need to kind of grow into. Both are interesting plot points. But on the achievement side, you have a ready-made plot line built into it, because if you have to achieve something in order to reach a class, you can tell that great underdog story of somebody being, born and they're told, no, there's no way you can achieve these mighty things, and then they work hard and they play hard, and the whole plot line is about them actually reaching this achievement and either succeeding or failing. Both are very interesting stories, though they feel very different, and obviously they play with very different thematic elements. The one where you would fail to achieve it is a story more about perhaps society is actually rigged, whereas the one where you do achieve it is more a perseverance of the human spirit kind of story. Okay. So, Damien says he's reminded of how the Fire Nation once had dragons they hunted to extinction to prove themselves in Avatar. Yes, indeed. Your manhood ceremonies could be a very relevant part of this kind of setup where your manhood or womanhood or personhood, your adulthood ceremony, where you basically have to do something to prove yourself an adult to participate in the society. And that could also be a very, very interesting part to play with. So it is worth considering how to play with your adulthood ceremonies into your hierarchy. Okay. I also want to talk about how important it is to look at clothing and hierarchy. And before I talk about my sash, I also want to talk about the Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Now, I'm not the world's biggest Brandon Sanderson fan, but I have read the books and I do like them. And what I want to talk about specifically is the concept of the safe hand. Okay, so in the culture of the light eyes, the women cover their hand. I think it's their dominant hand that they cover, their right hand, something like that, that they cover in like a sheath to, basically it's like very provocative in their society to be able to see a woman's safe hand. But there's also a class distinction beyond the gender distinction of the women basically not being able to use their one hand. The women also have classes. So lower class women will just wear like a fingered glove, and that still covers the hand, but it's considered to be very not in keeping with the spirit, because the noble women have like this full mitten on their safe hand, right? It's basically to show that they don't do work in a way. So it's very, I find that any culture that you build in some kind of visual representation of their hierarchy really works very, very well to stand out in the reader's mind. There's this amazing site on the internet that's like Way of Kings Prawn, where they have like women showing their safe hands in various poses, which is just hysterical. That's the kind of things that fans do with this sort of clothing attribute that becomes part of your social hierarchy. I also built social hierarchy into my clothing with my noble sash, and the sash defines not just your relationship within your family, but also your rank and your rank within the empire. And what this also gave me, and the other thing that comes from your social hierarchy, is how people express themselves, right? So I, for example, have the expressions in my world of those that are behind the sash, the nobles, and those that are before the sash, the peasants. There's a sash hook in all of my castles where a sash is hung, and only nobles are allowed to go behind that sash line because that's where the family lives. And then you have, and then I have expressions like you're hiding underneath her sash. So you're sheltering behind a higher noble's rank by, hiding behind their sash. So you've got a great deal of expressions that come from this. Brandon Sanderson did the same thing. He has all kinds of expressions around light eyes and dark eyes. And then he's got all of the expressions, as I said, around the safe hand. So don't just think of your social hierarchy in terms of defining it. Also think of the impact that it has on your people. How does it impact their clothing? Are there laws about it? How does it impact their jewelry? Do certain classes wear certain pieces of jewelry? And is there a rebellion from the lower classes around those kinds of clothing? For example, in Japan, because the samurai dressed so gaudily, it became a fashion statement for the merchant classes to dress somberly and to hide their wealth, which I think is a very interesting kind of counterpoint to what could happen. Okay, so that is social hierarchy. Have I missed anything in the chat? It does not look like it. Okay, so chat peoples, if you have questions around social hierarchy, go for it. Allura S says, oh, if you have a way to, if the way to prove yourself disappears, that's going to be trouble in society. Yes, absolutely. If your dragons suddenly vanish, like the Fire Nation's dragons vanished because of overhunting, you are going to have an absolute disaster in your society. And that would be a very interesting plot point to explore. Okay, so let's move on from social hierarchy to family structure. Now, family structure I've divided into 4 properties, and I'm going to talk about each of them: kinship structures, inheritance, property right, and political alliances. So family structure doesn't have to be restricted to the nuclear family. You can have polyamorous families where you have, say, 2 men and a woman, or 1 man and multiple women, and so on. And this will be driven by your society, the environment your society have found themselves in, the cultural norms that have evoked, and the other societies that they have encountered over the years. So I, for example, went with in Kisangi, I went with a 2 men, 1 woman setup, because the desert, which is where this society evolved, is a very, very harsh environment, and one that in fact required the labor of 2 men to raise the children of 1 woman, to generate enough food and shelter and so on to keep a family together. You actually needed 2 men working, just because of the dangers and the harsh conditions and so on. So it is very interesting to play with different kinds of family situations. You can also even have the whole village raises the child. Elephants do this as an example. So in an elephant herd, which is an all-female herd, the elephant woman, the female elephants all raise the children together, and the men are either solitary, or they are they group together in bull elephant herds. I don't know why I'm calling them men. Sorry, I mean bull elephant herds. So don't get stuck in our nuclear family. Think about broader concepts, like what would your family structures look like in your world, given the place where the society came to be, and the external factors that pressured them, and that they encountered other cultures and so on. And of course, family structures fundamentally affect all of the other things, which we'll get to. But first, I want to talk a little bit about kinship structures. And I've prepared 3 slides, because I cannot remember these kinship structures without an actual helpful guide. So, Hawaiian kinship. So there are 6 kinship structures defined by the people where they were encountered. And they're basically just a way to say, this is roughly how people count kinship. So the Hawaiian kinship structure is one where every generation that you're related to is basically the same. So your mother, your uncles, your fathers, what in English would be those words, they're all mothers and fathers, right? And your generation of your family are all siblings. Okay. And then your grandmothers they're all grandmothers and fathers, if you're clear on that. Now, the Sudanese kinship is, by contrast, an extremely defined one. And their language, and I'll tell you about the Swedish language as well, which does this as well. Their language defines not just this is your uncle, but this is your uncle on your mother's side. This is your aunt on your mother's side. This is your grandmother on your father's side. This is your grandmother on your mother's side, and so on. And then you've got your paternal cousins and you've got your maternal cousins. And in I don't know the Sudanese words, but in Swedish, you would say it is my morbror, or my mormor is my grandmother. Or you would say it is my farbror, which is my father's brother, my uncle on my father's side. Or my faster, which is my father's sister, my aunt on my sister's side. So your language would actually change to support these kinship models. Okay, so Sudanese and Hawaiian, what else have we got? So Eskimo is actually pretty much what we have in most of Western society. It's your uncle, your aunt, your uncle, your aunt, your cousins, your mother and father. So that's kind of the classic English structure as well, and it's what the Eskimos maintained. The Iroquois kinship structure has got a very, very interesting setup. So your mother, your aunt on your mother's side is also your mother, but your uncle on your mother's side is your uncle. And your uncle on your father's side is your father as well, but your father's sister, your aunt on your father's side, is your aunt. So it's a very interesting setup around like the male side and the female side, which I thought was a fascinating kinship model. And then your Crow kinship model is basically the same as the Iroquois, except that if we just go back there, you'll see that everything on the Iroquois side is cousins, but on the Crow side, you have a aunt and a father that come out of your father's sister. So that ties back to a kind of matrilineal inheritance model, where you might inherit not your father or your mother, well, you'd probably inherit from your mother, but not your father's goods, but you would inherit your mother's brother's goods. That's how matrilineal succession works. I'll talk more about that when we talk about inheritance. And then the Omaha kinship is where you have the same kind of setup with the aunt and father, except it's a mother and an uncle on the mother's side of the family tree. So all of those are very interesting, and they all tie back to inheritance to a large extent. And this is where kinship becomes very interesting, because it becomes about generational wealth. Okay? Who is going to get the stuff? Now, you can have a patriarchal society and still have matrilineal inheritance. For example, the Celts did this, I believe. I speak under correction, but I believe so. And so what that means is you don't inherit in a direct line from your father, because it's basically about like a trust of genetics. Like, you know that your sister and you shared, as a man, you know you and your sister share genes, and you know that your sister's children at least have, you know, her genes, which are the same as your genes, and therefore you give your wealth to your sister's children. Okay, and that is what a lot of these relationships are about. It is about determining how wealth flows down into the genes of, the man's genes in a lot of instances. And I don't say this to denigrate men or to say that men have always done this or whatever, but it is a simple fact that the woman generally knows that she's the mother. Like there is most of the time, there is no doubt about who the mother of a child is. It's mostly the doubt is about who the father of a child is, if there ever is doubt. And that's why a lot of these models work out the way they do. But even even once you've decided matrilineal or patrilineal, or maybe you don't at all, maybe all goods is held in community, which you can also have. And your community can be your family as a whole could hold the wealth together, and they could all share in that wealth. Allura says, it makes me wonder, specifically in Hawaiian kinship, if they separate it all. Like if someone marries into the family, all those people become part of the family. Everyone is then related. I believe, and I'm still researching kinship, so I don't want to speak with absolute authority, but I believe that there is kinship they distinguish between kinship by blood and kinship by marriage, at least partially. So if somebody marries in, they are kin, but they are kin by marriage rather than being kin by blood. I speak under correction, and when I, bring out the book on it, then I will speak with definitive surety. Okay, so you can hold all the goods and property in the family, and then it is just a matter of controlling within the family who has access to the goods rather than who owns the goods. But let's say you do have inheritance and you've decided matrilineal or patrilineal. You also should decide between primogeniture and ultimogeniture. Or if you're going to be really weird, I suppose you could give it to the middle child. Okay, so primo means the oldest gets it. It's kind of the one we're all familiar with from the Romans. But there are systems where the youngest gets the wealth of the family. And the reason why the youngest child gets it is because they are considered to be the child that will look after the parents in their old age, and thus they need the resources to look after the parents. So you could switch it on its head in terms of which child gets it. Of course, you could also divide the wealth equally between the different children, although you are highly unlikely to do this if land is your primary wealth, as I discussed extensively in one of my early videos. Because land is very hard to divide, right? So if you're a agricultural farming society and your wealth is tied up in land, it is probably going to be a firstborn son or a lastborn son or something like that that inherits the wealth, or daughter, or you could be sex independent, sex neutral. I also want to talk here about legitimacy, because wealth is not the only thing that you can inherit. And basically the whole plot of Game of Thrones is about primogeniture and legitimacy, right? Because our boy Joffrey is not Robert's son. I know, shock, horror, gasp, right? He's not Robert's son, but Robert is the king. So who's the heir? And that is the crux of the plot of King's Landing. Who has the right to the throne after they had overthrown the throne and had gained and put Robert on the throne? Now he's married to Cersei and her children aren't his. And the whole entire plot line just revolves around that exact point of legitimacy and inheritance. Okay, so that's inheritance and how it works. Let's talk about politics and kinship and family structures. Now, obviously, there is alliance through marriage. I mean, I do alliance through marriage. George R. R. Martin does alliance through marriage. The picture I've got up here is inspired by Rhaegar and Lyanna, who got married in secret and had Jon, who probably is the closest to the heir for the throne, and so on. But alliance through marriage is not your only familial structure. You can also build up an alliance through fosterage, especially with a noble society that fosters their children to another noble to raise, as is done in Game of Thrones, as was done in our history in Europe frequently. It was also done in Japan. It's basically you send your kid to another noble, and that noble raises the kid so that this builds an alliance between your two families. Okay. I do it in my world as well. In my world, of course, I call it sash mother and sash father and things like that because I have the sash and it's easy to work with that. So, and I mean, you can see George R. R. Martin uses it as well. Robert and Ned are so close because they were fostered together at the Eyrie under the stewardship of Jon Arryn. And that is how you can also build non-kin, non-family relationships necessarily, but friendships for life based on childhood friendships. And the last thing I want to touch on is just the hostage situation there at the bottom of the slide. And that is when you take a noble hostage to force their family to do something. Now, we did a lot of this in our history as well. We used to take children hostage to enforce that their parents become peaceful. You know, if there was rebellions, things like that, the children would often end up as hostages to enforce peace and so on. Catherine Kerr writes a whole story about this, where one of the princes of one of the kingdoms is kept captured for like 30 years. And then finally he's disinherited. And the dude who took him hostage is like, my dude, I fed you for 30 years. I'm not going to hang you now. You're free to go. And he lets him go, which is just, it was so funny. Like the hostage had spent more time trapped in a tower in his captor's castle than he had spent in his home kingdom. So you can play with some very interesting situations with your hostage situation and your fosterage and your kinship and so on. And that is more or less my story on this topic for now. As I said, I am working on this. Let me switch to the main scene. I am actively working on this as a topic for the Worldbuilding book. And so far, it's going well. So I'm pleased with my progress there. And that will be part of the podcast as we move forward. I am... the next episode of the podcast, by the way, will be out not next week, but the weekend after, unless you are a member of the channel. Members of the channel will get access probably this weekend when I record it tomorrow. And other than that, I guess that is my story for the first live stream of 2024. I hope that you all enjoyed it. I will see you next month. There will probably be a poll about the topic unless there's a close live stream that I've missed talking about. And it was, we have a question. And what if society has non-human races and, for example, fathers do not have strong instincts to raise kids? So, yes, absolutely. I spoke about this in my video on how to make a matriarchy. You can, if you flip the society on its head, you can do all kinds of interesting things. Like, think of the emperor penguins. The emperor penguin is the one who carries the eggs on his feet, and the emperor penguin male has got little nipples that secrete milk for the baby birds, right? So the emperor penguin is the one that raises the kids. The same with seahorses. Seahorses actually incubate the egg. So the female seahorse will eject the egg, and the male will actually take it into himself and incubate the egg and give birth to them. And there are other bird species as well. The cowrie, and I don't know if it's the emu, but one of them. The male builds a massive nest, and he sits there, and and all of the females come to his nest, and then they do the hanky panky, and she drops her eggs and she goes. And then the next female comes to his nest, they do the hanky panky and so on. So he could end up with like a nest of eggs from like 80 different females. And he knows he's the father, but they don't know which other females have been depositing eggs in his nest. And that could create a very interesting flipped on its head society where the father of the child, but you don't necessarily know the mother. And that could create a fascinating society. So yeah, absolutely. You can, with a non-human, take a look at all of our fantastic wildlife. We have so many different setups than our setup of the mother raises the child. There's these worms. There's these worms. This is amazing. Last story, I promise. There's these worms that they're hermaphrodites, so they're both male and female, right? Or they can be. And they duel each other. They fight each other to determine who is going to be the woman in this mating pair. And then they mate, and the one who lost the fight is the one who's stuck raising the kids. So it flips around depending on how well you fight against your other mating partner, which is just awesome and hysterical at the same time. So yeah, I mean, if you're going to play around with non-humans, go nuts. Absolutely. You've got a wide variety of options. And thanks to Dylan, and thanks to everybody who attended this live stream. I hope that you all enjoyed it, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.